Women at NCSA provides professional development opportunities for employees, affiliates, and students with the objective of creating a more diverse and inclusive environment through outreach, talks, and events like this one. These monthly events are structured to drive conversations around not only women's experiences, but also touching on subjects such as race and ethnicity, class, disability, sexuality, and so on, including today's subject, which is gender and pronouns. This event is intended to provide insight into the use of pronouns outside of he, him, his, and she, her, hers, in order to create a more inclusive environment for transgender and gender nonconforming students and colleagues. And we hope this can be an open conversation about trans identities, pronoun and name use, how to address someone you haven't met yet, and how to avoid making assumptions about gender and identity based on gender presentation and physical appearance. So the first portion of the event will be a moderated panel discussion. In the last 10 to 15 minutes of the event will be an audience Q&A. So please feel free to ask questions by using the chat function, or you can privately chat me directly throughout the discussion. Or when it's time for the audience Q&A, feel free to unmute and ask any questions you might have. But outside of the Q&A, we would appreciate if everyone could remain muted when you're not speaking. And it was shown on the beginning slide, but I do want to also note again that the event will be recorded up until the audience Q&A. So as soon as we finish the panel discussion, we're going to stop the recording to make space for an open dialogue amongst the audience and the panelists. We do also want to note that we're going to be sending a link to a brief survey towards the end of the event. And the survey is anonymous and totally optional, but we do appreciate any feedback we can get from you all. All right, so before we get started with the panel discussion, I want to introduce today's panelists. Unfortunately, Professor Kashani had something come up last minute, so she won't be able to join us, but joining us today are two amazing professors that I've had the pleasure of taking classes with here at U of I. So we have Professor Emma Velez, who is an assistant professor of gender and women's studies and affiliate faculty in Latino studies, as well as the unit for criticism and interpretive theory. Her research interests include Latina and Latinx decolonial feminisms, critical theory, feminist theory, and critical philosophy of race. And then we also have Professor Toby Beauchamp, who is an associate professor of gender and women's studies and affiliate faculty in the unit for criticism and interpretive theory as well. His work has examined the problem of visibility in trans politics, and latest project brings trans studies in conversation with the environmental humanities. I encourage you all to read more about these panelists and the work they're doing following the discussion. We're super lucky to have them here today, so thank you both for joining us. All right, so I think we're just getting the view organized a little bit here. All right, so to get started with the panel discussion, I wanted to first ask the panelists, what does it mean to be cisgender, and what does it mean to be transgender or trans?
I'll unmute myself first, yes. Thanks, Maggie, and thanks everyone for being here. I am so glad to be here at this event with my amazing colleague, Toby Beauchamp, and to be talking with you all today about pronoun use and how we can, as a community here at the University of Illinois, support our transgender community members. So I guess I can start with some preliminary definitions, and then maybe Toby can augment those as he sees fit. And I also want to start by saying, sharing my pronouns there, she, her, hers. I'm also open and use they, them pronouns as well. And I identify as a cis woman. So the definitions I'm going to give are actually from the Trans Student Educational Resources TSER page. And I'm actually going to drop a link here in the chat because there's a bunch of great working definitions. So I'm just going to share these definitions and you can check those out in the link. So a basic understanding of cisgender is a term that is used to describe folks who exclusively identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. The term cis isn't indicative of gender expression or sexual orientation or aspects of one's physical anatomy or even how one is perceived in their daily life. It's really about describing someone who identifies with the sex that they were assigned at birth. And then in terms of a kind of working definition for us for transgender, trans is a identity category that encompasses lots and lots of different gender identities of those who don't identify or exclusively identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. And the term trans is also not indicative of gender expression or sexual orientation or aspects of one's physical anatomy, or again, how someone might be perceived in their day-to-day life. And so these are a couple of working definitions, but I definitely want to turn it over to Toby.
Hi, I'm also super glad to be here with Emma and with Maggie. Thanks for inviting me. And I should say, I guess, that I am trans and also use he, him pronouns, which I have put in my Zoom name. Yeah, I really appreciate the definitions that Emma laid out and sort of also the caveats around those definitions. I feel like as someone who does research and also teaches in trans studies, I should be like ready to just have a sort of neat, easy definitions to give. But I find that the more that I write and read and teach on these things, the more complicated those definitions get. And, I think that, I totally agree with the definitions that Emma provided. And I think the caveats are actually really important parts of them, that just the bare fact of those identities are not indicative of necessarily anything about how someone understands their gender, how they express their gender, and how their gender sort of works for them in relation to other people or in different contexts in their lives. And lately, I've been feeling pretty cautious about thinking about these two terms, particularly cisgender and transgender, because I worry sometimes that when we invest too much in those two terms and trying to define them as different from one another, that it just creates a new kind of binary, and it maybe makes it seem like, trans people are the people who have to make decisions about their gender or who don't feel comfortable with their assigned gender, and that cis people don't have to make any decisions and always feel comfortable with how their gender is understood. And I think that loses a lot of nuance in how, people across all of these gender identities actually experience gender and think about their genders over the course of their lives and in the different contexts that they move in. So I think there's just a lot of complexity no matter what category we end up being in. And that, I try to keep in mind that those categories can really change over the course of our lives and just have a lot of complications.
All right, thank you both for that response. I think it's definitely really important to acknowledge that these terms are not black and white, and they can't be easily defined. And it's important to kind of dig deeper into the nuances of what these terms are doing and how we're using them in our daily lives. So to keep going to try to create some of that nuance, I guess, I wanted to ask you both, so what's the difference between transgender, someone who might identify as trans, and the identities of gender nonconformity that sometimes fall under trans and sometimes don't, such as non-binary, gender fluid, agender, and other labels that might signify someone is gender nonconforming or trans or just not cisgender?
I guess I can start since Emma took the lead on the previous question. Yeah, I mean, again, I feel kind of wary about giving like concrete definitions of any of these terms because it's my experience that they can mean fairly different things depending on who's using them and what they, what those terms mean to individual people. I think that there are many ways to be trans, just as there are many ways to be non-trans. And so to be gender non-conforming, I think that is a sort of broader way of thinking about gender as a relational kind of process that has to do with how the world around you understands you and sort of perceives and responds to your gender and the way that gender is expressed. And so I think there are plenty of trans people who understand themselves to be gender nonconforming and might actually adhere more to that kind of terminology than trans. But I also think there are other people who don't understand themselves as trans, but live in the world as gender nonconforming, maybe because how their gender is perceived because of their racial identity, maybe because of how their gender is perceived through a disability or through their sexuality. And so I think gender nonconformity ends up being, for me, a really broad term that can help us understand sort of the ways that gender is not just an individual decision, but is something that, is in relation to these sort of social institutions around us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for giving us that starting point, Toby, because I think that that's so important as we think about the many, many different experiences of living out gender and these identities, and how much the meaning of these terms is really negotiated in community and through relations and the networks that we're a part of, and that the kind of intersectional concerns that you laid out also play a really big role in terms of how people both experience and live out their gender identities and expressions. And yeah, it's really difficult to just try to give a clean and neat definition. That was something that I did appreciate about TSER as like giving a kind of lexicon of lots of different kinds of identities. And if you are looking for kind of a starting place, that would definitely not be the ending place. I would encourage folks to check out that glossary. It's not comprehensive, but it definitely gives a really great starting point. So if you do feel like you need some working definitions, that is a resource that I want to direct folks to.
Yeah, thank you both. I think a good response is you can always look these things up if you have further questions about the specific meanings, but I do think it's definitely an important note that these terms and labels do not apply universally and don't work for everyone. So I appreciate that point. My next question is, how does this all relate to pronouns? How do these labels kind of work with pronoun use, and why is this an important discussion to be having? Why is it important to use people's correct pronouns and correct labels?
Yeah, I guess I can take that one, or take a pass at it and then hand it back to Toby. And I'm going to kind of come at this from my training as a philosopher, kind of thinking about how we use language, right? And the ways in which language is so constitutive of our experiences of the world and of ourselves and other people. And so our language is one of the places where gender lives, right, in our lives. And so pronouns, being an extension of that, are an important aspect of how we be. As the philosopher who I don't endorse in any other capacity, except I think this is a smart thing, Heidegger says that language is a house of being. And I think that is, for me, to think about the importance of language, right, for affirming and also living out one's identity. Pronouns are a big part of that. And so just as our language is really important, because pronouns are part of language, they're really important, and they're really important for how people experience their identities. So yeah, that's kind of like maybe a meta starting point for the discussion of why pronouns matter for thinking about identity.
That super beautiful. Actually, I was thinking when you said where gender lives, I really like that framing of it. And I was thinking also about just the way our conversation has gone so far has really illustrated already like the sort of complexities of language and the difficulty of understanding gender through language. But also, I think if language is one of the places that gender lives, then it is also a place where gender can become lively. And so, I think pronouns are one of the ways that, we can use language to enact or open space for more ways of being gendered. So I think about pronoun, I think there's a sort of basic or should be a basic understanding that using the pronouns that people actually want to go by is a basic means of respect and providing dignity and affirming that people belong and are taken seriously and in our families, in our social groups, in our workplaces, et cetera. But I also think that when we pay attention to things like pronouns that are in English, especially like very gendered forms of language, that when we pay attention to them, then it's a way of using language to open space for more ways of understanding gender and allowing space for more people to think about gender in new ways. So I kind of see language and pronouns as, on one hand, as a form of like individual respect for people, right? And the way that they interact with us and the way that we treat people, but I also see it as sort of this political tool and social tool of being able to open new ways to ask questions and think about our own genders and to interact with genders, in gendered ways with other people.
I think both of those responses segue really nicely into the next question, which is what are neopronouns? How are neopronouns different from they, them pronouns, for example, and why might people use neopronouns?
Oh, it's my turn to start. So, again, I think people use pronouns, different forms of pronouns for many different reasons. So I don't want to make huge generalizations, but, nevertheless, in general, I think neopronouns are often intended to be a way to express a form of gender that is beyond, beyond something that can be encompassed by what are considered the standard pronoun options or gendered pronoun options in whatever language we're using. And I think in many cases, when people are, I think people have lots of reasons, their own individual reasons for selecting whatever pronouns they use, neopronouns or other. But I think the use of neopronouns for many people actually is a way of kind of disrupting gendered expectations and gender norms through language. And sometimes that disruption itself can be kind of a reflection of how people understand their own gender, right, as disruptive to the binary framework. Or other times that disruption is something that, like, by using this sort of unconventional language, then the disruption of that unconventional language can actually provide space for someone's gender to be understood or, made thinkable, right, for other people. Yeah, an example of neopronouns, thanks for asking that question. I kind of spaced the beginning, but yeah, so zir or zzer, which is often how ones with, instead of z with starting with x are often pronounced. Sometimes the pronunciations differ depending on who's using them, but usually like they're terms that are not, they're pronouns that are not typically used in the current moment in the language that you're speaking in, right? So they're not formally recognized by the language you're speaking in. And that's part of why they become sort of disruptive tools.
Yeah, I really appreciate that starting place for talking about neopronouns, Toby. And I really like both in this response and the response that you gave to the last question about how you pointed to the kind of both disruptive and like possibility that's realized through pronoun use for worlding different different worlds, worlding different worlds, but generating and bringing different worlds into being And I think that I also want to say that the term neo and neo pronouns also can be like a misnomer, right? So thinking about, while the, neo pronouns might refer to pronouns that don't get kind of formal recognition through the institutions that say what proper use of language is, that they also can be really old. Like, so for example, in the link that I put here, you see that some of the use of, for example, like the singular they or other forms of neopronouns actually are quite old in their usage. And I'm also, as a decolonial feminist, very interested in thinking about non-Western experiences of gender that aren't tied to a binary as well, and thinking about the languaging possibilities and different forms of pronouns that exist in those spaces as well. So yeah, just to kind of add to the great things that Toby said.
Yeah, I also just want to put another caveat, which is that even though Emma and I have been talking about the sort of world making and change and possibility that comes through language, I also don't want to give the impression that every person who uses they, them, or other sort of non-binary pronouns is doing so in order to change the world. Like sometimes people are using those terms because they're just the terms that are most meaningful to them, or they best capture their own understanding of their gender, and they're not necessarily doing it as a political action. But I think because of our research and our teaching interests, like we tend to think about things in that way, and think about gender in this sort of political frame, right? So, but I don't want to give the impression that that's the case in every person's decision.
Right, absolutely. And folks might be choosing pronouns because it's a way of making life more livable. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of political, but it's political at a different register, for sure.
Yeah, thank you both. Now I've kind of covered some definitions or lack of definitions, since we understand that they don't work perfectly universally, especially kind of outside of the context of the US. We do still want to work on not misgendering people, not mispronouncing people. So my next question is, how do I address someone that I haven't met yet? I'm sure a lot of people have known the recent trend to use they, them pronouns for everyone until they specify otherwise. I have strong feelings about this, but I definitely want to hear from both of you about whether or not you feel that's appropriate, or what a potential solution might be to using they, them pronouns as kind of a default.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Maggie. And I definitely know that it is near and dear to your heart and what you're thinking about right now in terms of where your work is. And I think that, I think this is like actually quite a good conversation to be having. And I'm really interested to hear Toby's thoughts about this as well, because I think that a lot of folks, especially folks who are sensitive to the topics that we're discussing, might default to they, them for folks that they don't know. Another strategy might be if you're not sure of someone's gender and the pronouns that they use, that you might also just refer to them by name until you are able to have a conversation with that person and actually establish through through a face-to-face or a Zoom-to-Zoom type of conversation what pronouns that person uses. But this, I think, actually my thinking about this is evolving because of, so full disclosure is that I am teaching the GWS Senior Seminar, of which Maggie is a member of that community. And my thinking about this is really evolving right now as, I don't know, Maggie, do you want to say a little bit? I don't want to like steal your thunder, but I think that my thinking about this is evolving because of your thesis project.
Sure, I can do a little self-promo here. My thesis project and the research that I'm doing right now is actually centered around this question. And my thoughts about it, which are very much influenced by Professor Beauchamp's trans studies class that I took with him, which kind of highlighted like the importance and specificity of they them pronouns for a lot of people, including myself. So I do use they them pronouns, which is part of the reason I don't feel it's appropriate to default to they them pronouns as this kind of universal. I think that really just doesn't work for everyone, and it is just, in my eyes, a different form of misgendering or mispronouncing someone. You're still not using the correct pronouns for that person. So in terms of solutions, I'm kind of working through those still, but I was also thinking about things like using a person's name instead of any pronouns if you know the person's name, or for example, how I'm doing right now, the person instead of them. Or we already do this. It's like the classic example of like somebody dropped their wallet, like I need to find this person. So it's kind of the hypothetical, like you don't know this person, so you don't know this person's pronouns and can't accurately kind of address the person until you do know. So yes, that is what generally and vaguely, imperfectly what my current research is about, but I would still like to hear more about what you both have to say.
Yeah, I was hoping that you would talk about how your research was shaping up too, so thanks for doing that. I think that, partly because gender and language are constantly like in motion, that there may not be like one perfect way to do this, right? So I think, sometimes you can pick up things from context clues, like if other people are talking with or about the person that you don't know, you can sort of pick up name or pronouns from them. That's not, sometimes that can be very helpful, and sometimes that's not perfect because those people also may not know that person's pronouns, or they might be getting them wrong, right? Or sometimes, like when I'm teaching, I often try to look for the author's website right before I'm teaching someone's work in class, and see how they describe themselves. Or I think that things like in a big group, you could say things like the person wearing the red shirt, or the person at the front of the line. Like, I think there are other ways that we can sort of mark out who we want to be referring to, other than using pronouns. And so I think there are many options. I also think using names instead of pronouns is a really good option, although there, of course, then there's a risk that you don't know the proper name, or that the person's name has changed. But so, I guess I would just say that I think part of the work in this is to really be thinking about the challenges and the sort of pros and cons of all these different options, and to sort of maintain a sense of flexibility that, it is likely that we're all going to make a mistake at some point, or we're not going to have the right information to be able to make the right decision, and to be sort of prepared for that to happen, and to be able to be flexible in looking for other ways of doing things in the future.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely still hearing the theme of like, nothing is going to work for everyone. I think that's a really important point that we're trying to drive home here. There is no single universal solution to these questions, but I do appreciate working through some potential alternatives. So my next question is, how do I correct myself or others if I realize the wrong pronouns or name are being used? Should someone correct it, or is it appropriate to move on? What are some potential solutions to that?
Yeah, so I can go ahead and take a pass at it first. And I would say my rule of thumb is to do it as quickly as it comes to my attention, and to make a quick apology and a quick correction in terms of practice and what pronouns I'm actually using, and to utilize the pronouns that the person uses. And I think a common mistake or a common thing that in these conversations that often gets that people get reminded of, which is to like not center yourself if you are the person who made the mistake, and to make it about you. And I think one of the things that I would really encourage folks to do is like to make that quick correction, but in the moment, if you're able to. But I think that the most meaningful thing will be to use and practice using the correct pronouns moving forward, right? So that apology, that correction is backed up by future action. And so that would be like the recommendation that I would give as informed by my trans and non-binary friends.
Yeah, I agree with that. I generally would advise against an overtry, you know, like an overly long apology, or sort of, you know, asking the person to make you feel better about it. You know, just sort of acknowledge it, own it, and make a commitment to doing better in the future. I think that those are sort of good rules of thumb. I wanted to say that, like, again, I think there's not necessarily like a one size fits all. And I know that's been a theme of this panel, and it might seem kind of like hilarious at this point, but as we're talking, I'm realizing that I think within trans studies and trans politics, it's actually a really important point, because the history of being recognized as trans, particularly in the US, has been through so heavily medicalized, and such a careful like scrutiny of whether you actually count as being trans. And so there really has been this sort of one size fits all model applied to trans people to be able to be legible and be recognized as who they are. And so I think the care that we're trying to take amongst ourselves and to try to convey in this conversation, that there has to be sort of flexibility, and there has to be sort of room to move and to make mistakes. Like, I think that that's not just like, oh, like context matters, like that is true. But I think that within thinking about the history of trans people and how we've been treated in this country, that actually is really important to sort of hold space for all of the nuances of what it might mean to be trans or non-binary, and to understand that there's a lot of different ways that can look, and how it can operate. So yeah, so with that said, I agree with everything that Emma said as general guidelines. And I can't remember, Maggie, if you also asked about ideas for correcting others. Was that part of your question? Yeah, so I think there are different strategies for correcting others as well. One of the things that I most like to do is when I hear someone use a pronoun for someone else that I know to be not right, I just try to make my next sentence in the conversation using the correct pronoun, you know, so it's just sort of a gentle reminder to the person that, you know, they didn't get it right, and, you know, this is actually the pronoun to be using, and but it doesn't require sort of like a lengthy conversation. It doesn't require you to be like, you were wrong. Like, you know, it just sort of is a way of like reaffirming what the best language is. And so that's usually the strategy I use, unless someone is repeatedly messing up, and then I might try to pull them aside. And, you know, especially if I know them. I guess I wouldn't do that to a stranger, but you know, if they're a friend or a colleague, I would try to have a gentle conversation with them on behalf of our mutual friend.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a great strategy for trying to respond in the moment, right? If you aren't the person, but you're witnessing someone else misgender, someone that you know, to just kind of gently offer that corrective by modeling. Yeah. I think that's great.
Yeah, I think it takes the pressure off of the person whose pronouns are being misused as well, to have to do the labor of making that correction. So I think it's usually very helpful when other people can make those sort of gentle, you know, corrective moves, you know, so that the work is not all placed on that one individual.
Yeah, I think those are definitely some great tips, and some things that I've luckily been seeing as like more common practices I think the quick correction and emphasis on just kind of getting it out, that you acknowledge that you messed up a little bit, but not placing so much emphasis on it that it starts to kind of take over the conversation. I think that can be really alienating, and I appreciate that tip a lot, of just recognize it, acknowledge it, and then kind of move on. So yeah, I think that's super important. My next question is, where can I get more information on this subject? I know Professor Velez has sent some links in the chat that I would definitely encourage everyone to use as kind of starting points, but like she said, not ending points of where you're doing this research. And another portion of the question, is it appropriate to ask trans folks or those that use pronouns outside of he and she to educate me on this subject?
Yeah, I'm going to drop a link in the chat as well. That can be sort of another place to look again as a sort of beginning. What I like about that mypronouns.org site is I think that it provides enough information so that you can get a basic understanding of the issues and the questions, but my sense of it has been that it doesn't actually make universal proclamations about what pronouns are or how they should be treated. And then it also, in the resources tab, it has a number of videos with trans and non-binary folks sort of talking about why pronouns matter to them, and sort of providing more ideas about how to use them properly, how to talk about pronouns with other people. So yeah, so if people are looking for those kinds of resources, that might also be a good spot.
And I wanted to share a link to Uiuc's LGBT Resource Center as well, because they put on lots of programming and also have panels like the one that we're having today. So if you're looking for kind of the next thing that you want to look at if you're trying to educate yourself or get more resources, I definitely encourage you to check out the LGBT Resource Center here at Uiuc. But there was another aspect of your question, Maggie, which was, will you repeat it?
Yeah, so the other portion of my question is it appropriate to ask trans folks or folks who might use different pronouns outside of he and she to educate us on these subjects? I know it's important to ask your friends and family their specific preferences, as we're obviously talking about how these things don't universally work. So I'm kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, oh, I think we lost Professor Beauchamp. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about kind of balancing learning the specific preferences of those around us and not depending on trans folks for that information and this education.
Yeah. Oh, and Toby's back. That's good.
Sorry, I got kicked out. I think the Wi-Fi in my neighborhood seems to be pretty bad today. I'm sorry.
No worries.
No worries.
Yeah, I would say, just no in response right away to your question. No, it's not appropriate to, as particularly in that way, like approach a trans person or a non-binary person, or a person who has a non-binary gender identity and be like, will you educate me about, XYZ, or be a representative and speak on behalf of your community? And I think that is never appropriate. That's asking a lot of emotional and intellectual labor of someone. And it's also asking someone to speak on behalf of, like, as we've been saying, like a really, really diverse communities of folks and diverse experiences. So I think that the best way to approach this is to come to events like this from experts who have agreed to have these conversations, or to try to educate yourself as much as you can, and then approach a personal conversation, with someone if you know them. And have a relationship. And so that would be kind of, I think, the starting place. But definitely do want to underscore that yeah, we shouldn't ask people to speak on behalf of their communities. And we also, oops, we lost Toby again. And we also should try to educate ourselves in the best ways that we can before trying to have those conversations with others.